Ever think about how a bunch of stone walls held off whole armies for years? Medieval castles weren't just big homes. They were battle-ready machines built to beat the odds. Their power wasn't just in how strong they were, it was in how smart they were. And it all started with one question: where to build the castle. These builders chose high ground whenever possible: hills, cliffs, and rocky outcrops, forcing attackers to fight gravity before they even reached the walls. The ultimate medieval workout plan: climb a steep hill in full armor while people throw rocks at you. At Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, attackers had to trudge up a steep volcanic rock that left them exhausted before battle even began. Water features provided instant protection on multiple sides. Castles on peninsulas or islands like Bodiam Castle with its massive surrounding moat created barriers that siege equipment couldn't cross. Approach routes were deliberately made narrow, winding, and exposed, forcing attacking armies to march in thin, vulnerable lines. Some castles only had a single approach path, while others sat above drop-offs that eliminated entire attack angles. Weather worked as a defensive ally, too. Winter winds would blast exposed routes, and spring rains turned dirt paths into mud pits. Nothing ruins a good siege like discovering your heavy siege tower is slowly sinking into 6 inches of mud. At Carrigsenden Castle, frequent rain made the steep limestone cliff nearly impossible to climb safely. The natural terrain also served as a psychological weapon. Imagine marching for days only to arrive at a castle perched on an impossibly steep cliff or surrounded by treacherous marshland. Many attacking forces lost their nerve before a single arrow was fired. Records show that some sieges were abandoned simply because the attacking army couldn't figure out how to overcome the natural obstacles. Forests were preserved around castles to restrict the movement of siege weapons and provide cover for defenders to launch counterattacks. Castle builders sometimes even engineered the landscape, creating artificial ponds or clearing specific areas to eliminate cover for approaching enemies. These natural defenses were just the beginning of a castle security system. Once attackers managed to reach the actual structure, they would face the next challenge. Once attackers reached a castle after battling natural defenses, they faced walls specifically designed to withstand nearly anything. Medieval castle walls weren't just big, they were engineering marvels built to absorb punishment. The sheer size would shock most modern visitors. Many castle walls stood 20 feet thick, about the length of a school bus. Dover Castle's walls measured nearly 21 feet at their thickest. Medieval contractors never had to worry about their clients complaining, "I said thick walls, not that thick." This massive thickness served a practical purpose in absorbing energy from battering rams and other siege weapons. Medieval wall construction followed a clever sandwich approach. Workers built 2 parallel stone faces and filled the space between with smaller stones, broken rubble, and mortar. This rubble core created walls both immensely strong and somewhat flexible, able to absorb impacts without cracking. Many featured a sloped base called a talus that deflected attacks upward instead of straight into the wall, making battering rams less effective. It also created a troublesome angle for siege ladders. Medieval architects discovered that slippery slope wasn't just a logical fallacy, it was a great defense strategy. Sophisticated castles featured concentric walls, an outer wall and a taller inner wall. This meant even if attackers breached the first wall, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing zone between walls, with defenders shooting from both sides. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place, literally. Some builders incorporated small pebbles into sections where enemy sappers might try to tunnel under walls. These loose materials would shift and make noise when disturbed, alerting guards to digging activities. Medieval alarm systems, no batteries required, just physics and gravel. While these mighty walls could withstand tremendous punishment, resourceful attackers developed specialized weapons to overcome them. But even the most formidable siege equipment often found its match in the castle's next line of defense. Gatehouses weren't doors. They were mousetraps, but the mice wore armor. The gatehouse represented both the weakest point in castle defenses and, paradoxically, often the strongest. Medieval engineers transformed what could have been a vulnerability into one of history's most ingenious death traps. A typical gatehouse consisted of multiple barriers. First came a drawbridge over the moat. Behind this waited heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, but the true danger lay just beyond. The most crucial defensive element was the portcullis, a heavy wooden or iron grate that could be dropped from above. Many advanced gatehouses featured two portcullises spaced about 20 feet apart. Medieval architects invented the world's first crush zones long before car manufacturers thought of them, except these were designed to crush people, not absorb impact. The ceiling contained murder holes, openings through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, or burning pitch onto trapped attackers. Nothing says unwelcome guest quite like a hot oil shower from above. Some murder holes at major castles measure over a foot wide, allowing for particularly unpleasant surprises. Arrow loops line the walls, allowing archers to fire from protected positions. These narrow slits gave defenders a wide field of fire while presenting the smallest possible target. Medieval arrow slits, the original "I can see you but you can't see me" technology. The entire gatehouse is usually projected outward from the main walls, creating a three-sided kill box. This arrangement allowed defenders to rain down destruction from above and both sides simultaneously. The gatehouse at Beaumaris Castle extends nearly 40 feet beyond the main walls, creating a gauntlet few attackers survived. Some castle designers added devious psychological elements like sharp turns that disoriented attackers and prevented battering rams from building momentum. Medieval equivalent of "you can't get there from here" was literally built into the architecture. The most cunning trick was the false gate, a convincing-looking entrance designed to draw attackers into an even more heavily defended area. Medieval catfishing, when that attractive entrance turns out to be a deadly trap. While the gatehouse represented a formidable ground-level defense, a castle's full defensive potential couldn't be realized without utilizing its most obvious advantage. Height offered a crucial advantage in warfare, and medieval castle builders used this principle to devastating effect. The tops of castle walls and towers were sophisticated weapons platforms designed to rain death upon attackers. The castle wall's most recognizable feature, crenellations, weren't just decorative. The raised sections or emerlins protected defenders, while gaps or embrasures allowed them to shoot arrows or throw projectiles. Medieval architects understood social distancing centuries early: stay behind the stone and shoot through the gaps. Behind these ran the wall walk, a pathway where defenders could move quickly around the perimeter. These were wide enough for two armored men to pass without anyone awkwardly falling off. Shooting from above gave defenders a significant edge. Longbowmen could rain arrows from 200 yards away, while crossbowmen handled closer targets with armor-piercing bolts. Some towers featured arrow slits arranged to create overlapping fields of fire. Heavier weapons included springalds, large crossbow-like devices hurling darts powerful enough to skewer multiple attackers. Nothing brings enemies together quite like being pinned by the same giant dart. Simple physics made for the most terrifying weapons. Heavy rocks dropped from heights of 30 to 60 feet, crushed shields, helmets, and the people underneath. A 20-pound rock dropped from 40 feet hits with the force of a horse kick. Defenders heated sand or water. Contrary to popular belief, oil was too expensive for regular use to pour through machicolations, stone projections with floor gaps. Hot sand would get under armor, causing excruciating burns, while boiling water could scald attackers to death. While these elevated defenses made direct assaults nearly suicidal, determined attackers often tried to bypass walls entirely. This led castle designers to develop yet another critical defense. Approaching a medieval castle wasn't as simple as walking up to the front door. Between attackers and those stone walls typically lay a massive ditch, the moat, creating a serious problem for invading armies. Just when you thought attacking a castle couldn't get worse, now you need swimming lessons. Most moats measured between 10 to 30 feet wide and 5 to 10 feet deep. While water-filled moats were common, they weren't just about drowning enemies. They prevented tunneling underneath walls, a technique called sapping, as the water table would flood any attempted tunnels. They also forced attackers to build bridges or use boats, both dangerous options when arrows are raining down. Dry moats worked effectively, too. These deep trenches could contain sharpened stakes, metal spikes called caltrops, or, in warmer regions, even dangerous animals. Nothing says "go away" quite like a ditch full of snakes. Some castle builders took psychological warfare to new levels by filling moats with sewage and rotting garbage. The smell alone might make attackers reconsider their plans. Crossing these barriers required portable bridges or massive filling operations where soldiers would dump dirt and timber into sections of the moat, all while being targeted from above. Drawbridges added another clever defense layer. Operated by counterweight systems or chains hidden inside the gatehouse, they could be raised quickly to create an impassable gap. Some advanced castles featured multiple drawbridges in sequence, creating several obstacles to overcome. Interestingly, archaeologists examining Bodiam Castle found its impressive-looking moat was actually quite shallow in many places, suggesting it was designed partly for show. Medieval lords understood that sometimes looking tough was half the battle. While moats excelled at slowing ground attacks and complemented the wall defenses we discussed earlier, any invaders who managed to cross these watery death traps would next face an even greater challenge. Medieval castle towers weren't just impressive stone structures, they were sophisticated battle stations that controlled the entire defensive system. Rising up to 100 feet tall, towers gave defenders the ultimate advantage of height and visibility. First and foremost, towers served as early warning systems. Lookouts stationed at the top could spot approaching armies days before arrival, using smoke signals, fire beacons, or flag systems to alert the castle. The Tour de Constance in France featured a special chamber for signal fires visible 20 miles away. Those medieval lookouts were like human traffic cameras, except instead of speeding tickets, they handed out arrows. Tower design evolved significantly over time. Early square towers had a serious flaw: blind spots at corners where attackers could work unseen. By the 12th century, round or D-shaped towers became standard, eliminating blind spots and making it nearly impossible for battering rams to find flat surfaces to strike. These curved walls also deflected projectiles better than flat surfaces. Strategic placement was crucial. Towers were typically spaced 100 to 200 feet apart, the effective range of a longbow, ensuring overlapping fields of fire where attackers would face arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. Try dodging arrows from multiple directions while climbing a ladder. It's the medieval version of a very unfair video game. Inside, castle designers created specialized fighting platforms with arrow loops, narrow slits that allowed defenders to shoot while remaining protected. These openings were cleverly splayed inward, giving archers wide visibility while presenting tiny targets to enemies outside. Towers connected to wall walks, allowing defenders to move quickly between positions. Many featured spiral staircases curving clockwise, a small but brilliant detail that gave defenders coming down the advantage while hindering right-handed attackers climbing up. With these towering advantages secured, castle defenders still needed one more crucial element to withstand long sieges. Once the gates slammed shut and the drawbridge raised, a medieval castle transformed from a fortress into a self-contained community. The real challenge wasn't just keeping enemies out, it was keeping everyone inside alive. The original lockdown had nothing to do with pandemics and everything to do with not getting murdered. Food storage formed the backbone of siege survival. Castle designers built massive underground storerooms called undercrofts specifically to hold enough provisions for months of isolation. These cool, dry spaces preserved grain, beans, and dried fruits, staples that could last through long sieges. Barrels of salted fish, smoked meats, and hard cheeses lined the walls. Most castles maintained food stores to last at least 3 to 6 months, with some prepared for a full year of isolation. Dover Castle in England had storage capacity for a garrison of 100 men to survive for nearly a year. Medieval meal prep wasn't about Instagram photos. It was about not starving while arrows flew overhead. Water supply proved even more critical than food. No matter how thick your walls, thirst would defeat you within days without access to clean water. Castle builders solved this problem by digging deep wells directly into the bedrock beneath the central courtyard, or keep. Some of these wells reached astounding depths. The well at Crac des Chevaliers in Syria plunges 120 feet down. Other castles collected rainwater in massive cisterns that could hold thousands of gallons. The smartest castle designers built their wells before constructing anything else, ensuring workers had water during the years-long building process. Nothing ruins your day quite like spending 5 years building impenetrable walls, then realizing nobody thought about drinking water. Daily life during a siege took place in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. The castle population swelled beyond its normal size as peasants from surrounding lands sought protection behind its walls. Space became precious. Great halls that normally hosted feasts transformed into communal sleeping areas. Privacy vanished, Noble families who typically enjoyed private chambers might share space with dozens of others. Medieval castle Wi-Fi would have had serious bandwidth issues, except the only thing streaming was the occasional leak in the roof. Sanitation presented another major challenge. Castle designers built latrines that emptied through chutes in the outer walls, a simple but effective system during normal times. During sieges, however, these became vulnerable points that enemies could climb or use to start fires. Alternative arrangements included chamber pots emptied into dedicated waste pits in the courtyard. Some larger castles featured sophisticated systems. Pembroke Castle in Wales had a massive latrine tower that could accommodate 20 people simultaneously. Medieval architects understood. No matter how fancy your castle, everybody poops. Health concerns mounted as sieges dragged on. Fresh vegetables quickly ran out, raising the risk of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Doctors stored herbs and medicines, but their effectiveness was limited by medieval medical knowledge. Castle inhabitants relied heavily on brewing beer and wine, not just for morale, but because the fermentation process made these drinks safer than potentially contaminated water. Beer, keeping medieval defenders both hydrated and slightly more optimistic about being surrounded by enemies since 1066. The psychological impact of siege life cannot be overstated. Boredom, fear, and claustrophobia affected everyone trapped inside. To combat this, castle life continued with structure and routine. Guards maintained regular watches, craftspeople continued essential work, and religious services provided comfort and time markers. Games like chess, dice, and backgammon helped pass the endless hours of waiting. Being trapped in a castle during siege was like the world's worst vacation. Terrible accommodations, limited menu, and the neighbors keep trying to kill you. While the towering defenses we discussed earlier kept attackers at bay, sometimes castle inhabitants needed ways to slip in and out undetected. The most important doors in medieval castles were often the ones nobody could see. Behind massive walls and towers lurked networks of hidden passageways, concealed doors, and secret tunnels that served as both emergency exits and strategic advantages. The original emergency exits didn't have those annoying alarms, but they did occasionally have snakes. Secret escape tunnels known as posterns or sally ports allowed defenders to slip out undetected during sieges. These narrow passages typically emerged far from the main castle in wooded areas or ravines. Dover Castle features a famous example, a 200-foot tunnel through solid chalk cliffs that wasn't rediscovered until 1794. These weren't just emergency exits, they were medieval versions of ghosting an unwanted party guest. These hidden routes enabled defensive raids. Small groups could sneak out at night to sabotage enemy siege equipment or attack sentries. Records from the 1216 siege of Dover Castle describe defenders using sally ports for nighttime attacks that destroyed enemy catapults. Most of these exits had multiple sharp turns to prevent enemies from rushing in if they discovered the passage. Some castle tunnels served more practical purposes, connecting different buildings within the complex. During peaceful times, these provided convenience. During sieges, they allowed defenders to move reinforcements quickly without crossing open areas where they might be targeted. False passages represented a darker aspect of these systems, deliberately designed traps for infiltrators. Some led to dead ends where enemies would be cornered, others contained hidden pits with spikes at the bottom. Caerlaverock Castle in Scotland featured a fake escape tunnel that led to a flooded chamber where intruders would drown. The secrecy of these passages created vulnerability as well as strength. Several castles fell because of betrayal involving hidden entrances. In 1330, Nottingham Castle was penetrated through a forgotten tunnel from a nearby tavern. At Chateau Gaillard, attackers discovered an unguarded toilet chute that allowed them to infiltrate the fortress. The castle designer who forgot to put guards near the bathroom probably had a really bad performance review. While secret passages provided crucial advantages during attacks, the ultimate defense remained the castle's ability to resist and counter the specialized siege weapons that attackers brought against its walls. Medieval siege machines were impressive, but castle defenders weren't just sitting around waiting to be crushed. They developed countermeasures that turned attacking a castle into a deadly game of medieval chess. When attackers rolled up with battering rams, giant logs with metal caps, defenders would drop massive stones directly onto them from the battlements. These weren't pebbles. We're talking about boulders weighing hundreds of pounds that could splinter wood and crush unfortunate soldiers below. the medieval equivalent of dropping a piano on someone's head, except nobody got a funny tune at the end. Fire was another favorite defender's tool. When siege towers, those massive wooden structures on wheels, approached the walls, archers would unleash volleys of flaming arrows at them. Defenders also used long hooks on ropes to grab the towers and pull them off balance. Nothing ruins your day like climbing a 60-foot siege tower only to feel it suddenly leaning sideways like a drunk trying to climb stairs. Trebuchets presented a different challenge. These giant catapults could hurl stones from a distance, so defenders reinforced walls where impacts were expected and conducted nighttime raids to sabotage these machines. Some clever defenders even counted the seconds between launches to predict where to avoid standing. One particularly nasty siege tactic was biological warfare. Attackers would sometimes catapult diseased animal carcasses over the walls. The defenders' response? They catapulted some of the mess right back, along with beehives and wasps' nests. Talk about returning unwanted gifts with interest. Countermining was crucial when attackers tunneled under walls. Defenders dug their own tunnels to intercept them, flooding enemy tunnels with smoke or releasing attack dogs. Many castles kept specialized anti-siege equipment ready, including wooden frames called hoardings that could be quickly assembled to extend the range defenders could drop things from. While the previous section showed how castles used architecture to create death traps, these active defenses proved medieval defenders weren't just relying on thick walls. They fought back with ingenuity that would make modern military strategists proud. And when all else failed, they always had one more powerful weapon in their arsenal. Success in medieval warfare often came down to who could last the longest. Castles turned time itself into a weapon against attackers. Psychological warfare was a key strategy. Defenders would feast on battlements, making sure the smell of roasting meat drifted toward hungry besiegers. Medieval trash talk didn't need words. Just a chicken leg waved tauntingly from a tower window. Sieges bankrupted attackers. A typical army in the 1300s cost about 500 gold pieces daily. After weeks of going nowhere, many lords simply ran out of money. The siege of Kenilworth Castle lasted 6 months before attackers gave up. Weather favored defenders. Winter sieges were brutal for armies camping outside. More soldiers died from cold, disease, and hunger than from fighting. Castle residents weren't staying at a 5-star resort, but compared to attackers sleeping in mud, they might as well have been. Castle defenders mastered surprise attacks called sorties, small groups rushing out from hidden gates to target siege equipment or supply lines before quickly retreating. Deception helped too. Helmets on poles made it seem like more soldiers guarded the walls. Trumpets and drums created the impression of reinforcements arriving. The most effective defense was often patience. About 60% of castle sieges ended with attackers simply giving up. While the previous section showed how castles actively fought against siege machines, this combination of patience and psychological warfare completed their defensive strategy, turning stone structures into active participants in medieval power struggles. Being a knight sounds exciting, right? Big castles, shiny armor, heroic battles. But the truth was nothing like the stories. Life back then was rough, and knights had it harder than most. This wasn't some fairy tale. Life as a medieval knight was brutal. The real question is, could you handle it? It all started early. Not early in the day, but early in life. At just 7 years old, your childhood ended. Not because you misbehaved, but because that's when knight training kicked in. While other kids were learning how to spell, you were packing up to serve a lord you'd never met. At age 7, these young boys became what was called a page. This wasn't just some light after-school activity. This was their entire life now. They moved into the castle of a lord or knight, often someone they'd never met before. Talk about the worst sleepover ever. It lasted for 7 whole years. The daily routine for these kids was brutal. They woke up before sunrise and immediately began serving the household. No hitting the snooze button when you're a page, unless you wanted to be the snooze button someone else hit. They learned proper manners and how to behave around nobles. One wrong move could get them a smack across the back of the head. They learned to ride horses when their legs were barely long enough to reach the stirrups. Many pages fell off so many times they were basically human bouncy balls. Their first lesson wasn't how to ride a horse, but how to fall off a horse without dying. These boys cleaned, carried messages, and served food to the knights and lords. The original food delivery service, except the tip was not getting yelled at. They had to memorize all the rules of chivalry, learn about heraldry, and study the lineages of important families. All this while, modern 7-year-olds struggle to remember to brush their teeth without being reminded. When they turned 14, these boys graduated to become squires. But this wasn't a graduation that came with presents and cake. Instead, they got the honor of harder work and more painful training. Congratulations on your promotion. Your reward is twice the work and triple the bruises. As a squire, you were basically a knight's personal assistant. You cleaned his armor, which was covered in all sorts of unpleasant substances after battle. You helped him dress for battle, which could take up to 30 minutes with all those metal pieces. You cared for his horses, maintained his weapons, and carried his shield in battle. The physical training was where things got really tough. Every single day, these teenage boys practiced fighting with wooden swords, lances, and maces. Their teachers didn't go easy on them either. Today's lesson: I'll hit you with this stick until you learn how to stop me from hitting you with this stick. Studies of medieval skeletons show that many squires had healed fractures in their arms, ribs, and collarbones from training accidents. Medieval healthcare plan? Rub some dirt on it and get back to training. The first walk-it-off program in history. They trained in full armor too, which could weigh up to 60 pounds. Imagine doing push-ups while wearing your entire wardrobe at once. Many passed out from heat exhaustion, especially during summer training. There were no weekends off, no summer vacation, no sick days unless you were literally dying. Oh, you've only got one working arm today? Perfect time to practice your left-handed sword technique. No video games or movies to relax with after a hard day. Their entertainment was listening to stories about other knights who had suffered even more than they were suffering now. Medieval motivation technique. You think you're having a bad day? Let me tell you about Sir William, who fought with 3 arrows in his behind. This brutal training continued for 7 more years. By the time these young men reached 21, they had spent 2/3 of their lives preparing for knighthood. Their bodies were already covered in scars, and many had broken bones that never set quite right. And after all that pain and sacrifice, the real hardships of being a knight were just beginning. Because becoming a knight wasn't exactly a fancy celebration with cake and presents either. Though, if you made it this far without permanent brain damage from all those hits to the head, that was kind of a gift in itself. Not everyone got the deluxe knighting package. While some lucky nobles did receive elaborate ceremonies, most knights-to-be got what we might call the economy version of knighthood. Many were knighted right on the battlefield, covered in mud and blood, minutes before they might die. Talk about a rushed promotion. Congrats on the new job title. Now try not to get killed in the next hour. The battlefield knighting was quick and dirty. The commander would tap the squire's shoulders with a sword and mutter a few words. No music, no feasting, just a quick, "You're a knight now," and back to the chaos. Historical records from the 100 Years' War show that during the Battle of Crécy alone, over 200 squires were knighted this way, with more than half of them dying within the same day. Medieval career advancement came with some serious fine print. For those who did get the traditional ceremony, it wasn't exactly a fun party either. The night before becoming a knight, candidates had to undergo a ritual called the Vigil. This meant staying awake all night in a cold church, praying nonstop while wearing white robes to symbolize purity. No snacks, no bathroom breaks, just hours of kneeling on stone floors until your knees felt like they were on fire. During this all-night prayer session, the soon-to-be knights had to confess all their sins to a priest. Every single one. From stealing apples as a child to impure thoughts about the miller's daughter. Nothing builds team spirit like sharing your deepest secrets with your fellow knights in training while your legs go numb from kneeling. By morning, these poor guys were exhausted, hungry, and probably questioning their life choices. Then came the actual ceremony where they had to kneel again on those already aching knees while various pieces of armor were handed to them one by one. Each piece came with a lecture about what it symbolized. The helmet represented dignity, the sword meant justice, the shield stood for protection of the weak. According to medieval manuscripts, some of these ceremonies could take up to 3 hours. Imagine standing there in half your armor, trying not to fall asleep, while someone drones on about what your left gauntlet symbolizes spiritually. And you thought graduation speeches were boring. The final act was the dubbing. a blow to the neck or shoulder with the flat of a sword. This wasn't a gentle tap either. Records from the 13th century mention that the blow should be hard enough that he shall remember it all his life. Nothing says welcome to knighthood like a good whack that leaves a bruise for weeks. After all this, there was usually a feast, but unlike modern graduation parties where you get to relax, the new knight had to serve food to everyone else first, wearing full armor the entire time. Historical accounts tell us that many new knights couldn't even enjoy their own celebration meals because they were too nervous about their first assignments. Because here's the real kicker. Immediately after becoming a knight, you were expected to prove yourself worthy of the title. Many were sent straight into dangerous missions or told to prepare for battle. One French chronicle records that during the siege of Rouen, 12 newly knighted men were sent to the front lines the same day as their ceremony, with their armor still shiny and unworn. So you survive 14 years of brutal training only to face an uncomfortable ceremony followed by an immediate life or death situation. Just when you thought the hard part was over, you discovered that earning the title of knight was merely the beginning of your troubles. Once you became a knight, your most constant companion was your armor. That shiny metal shell you see in museums looks cool, but wearing medieval armor was like being trapped inside a walking oven with the flexibility of a lamppost. A full suit of plate armor from the 1400s could weigh between 40 to 60 pounds. That's like carrying around a third grader on your back all day long. The weight was distributed across your body, but that didn't make it much easier to bear during long battles or tournaments. Knights didn't just slip into their armor like a jacket. Getting dressed required help and started with a padded garment called a gambeson to prevent chafing. Then came chainmail, thousands of interlocking metal rings. Finally, plate armor pieces were attached one by one. Records show that wealthy knights employed dedicated servants just to help them dress. Medieval armor was like the world's worst IKEA furniture, impossible to assemble by yourself and guaranteed to leave you frustrated and sweating. The entire process could take 20 to 30 minutes with experienced help. During urgent situations, knights sometimes had to skip pieces or wear only partial armor. Once sealed inside your metal cage, summer temperatures could reach over 100 degrees. Knights would lose gallons of sweat during battle. Many passed out from heat exhaustion before reaching the enemy. Medieval knights invented the sauna bath. They just wore it into battle. And bathroom breaks? Some armor had small openings, but in battle, you either held it, found a quiet moment to disassemble crucial pieces, or, well, there's a reason Squires hated cleaning armor after battles. The helmet was its own torture device. Once you lowered the visor, your vision was reduced to a narrow slit. Breathing became labored, and your own hot breath bounced back into your face. Tests with replica helmets show that a knight's voice would be muffled by about 60%, making battlefield commands difficult to hear. The smell inside a well-used suit defied description. The padding absorbed sweat and couldn't be washed easily. Medieval texts describe the smell of knights after battle as most foul and like death itself. Knights didn't need to swing their swords to defeat enemies. Sometimes they just needed to remove their helmets. Many knights couldn't even mount their horses without help. Some suits of armor were so rigid that if a knight fell over, he would struggle to get up, like a turtle flipped on its back. But as uncomfortable as armor could be, it was still better than the alternative. At least inside that metal shell, you had some protection against the dangers of medieval life. And trust me, you'd need every bit of that protection, because a knight's life was about to get a whole lot more complicated once the action started. All those years of training and that uncomfortable armor led up to one main thing: battle. Knights are famous for fighting, but medieval combat wasn't anything like the neat, choreographed sword fights you see in movies. Medieval battlefields were incredibly loud. Hundreds of men shouting war cries, horses neighing in panic, weapons clanging against shields and armor, wounded fighters screaming in pain. All created a wall of sound that was overwhelming. It was like being at the world's worst concert where, instead of asking for your money back, you were just trying not to die. Knights couldn't hear commands from their leaders through all this noise, especially with those helmets on. Chronicles from the Battle of Towton in 1461 mention that commanders had to use trumpet signals because voice commands were useless in the chaos. Vision was another major problem. With those narrow eye slits in their helmets, knights could barely see what was right in front of them. It was like trying to drive a car while looking through a mail slot. You're guaranteed to hit something. You just don't know what. Then there was the ground itself. Medieval battles churned up the earth, turning fields into mud pits. Knights regularly slipped and fell during combat. And once you were down in that armor, getting back up quickly was nearly impossible. Nothing says mighty warrior like flailing around in the mud like a flipped turtle while someone tries to stab you. Contrary to popular belief, knights didn't usually die from dramatic sword cuts. Most battlefield deaths came from blunt force trauma, maces, warhammers, and poleaxes that could dent armor and crush the person inside it. Medical examinations of skeletal remains from medieval battlefields show that many knights died from head trauma, despite wearing helmets. The actual fighting was nothing like elegant duels. It was more like a violent shoving match where everyone was trying to knock their opponents down. Knights would grapple, wrestle, and use their shields as weapons. Battle could last for hours. Knights would become exhausted, dehydrated, and disoriented. Many died not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. A Spanish battlefield account from 1385 described knights who fell without a wound, their strength baked out of them by the sun and their own armor. Even if you won the battle, you might not survive your wounds. Medieval medicine was primitive, and infection was a major killer. Medieval antibiotics consisted mainly of prayer and hoping for the best. One curious fact, most battles weren't actually that deadly for knights specifically. Common foot soldiers died at much higher rates than knights. This wasn't because knights were better fighters, it was because they were worth more. Capturing a knight alive meant you could demand a ransom for his return. Medieval combat had its own VIP section where the entry fee was paid in fancy armor and the exit fee was paid in cold, hard cash. After surviving the chaotic nightmare of medieval battle, knights might have hoped for some well-deserved rest. But the harsh reality of knighthood meant that danger and hardship weren't limited to the battlefield. When they weren't fighting in chaotic battles, knights had what you might call normal days. But don't picture them lounging around in castles being fed grapes by servants. A knight's daily routine was filled with responsibilities, rules, and more of that never-ending training. Dawn broke early for knights. Most were up before sunrise, beginning their day with prayer. The medieval version of a morning coffee was kneeling on a cold stone floor while your knees screamed in protest. After prayers came a light meal, usually bread and ale, sometimes with cheese or cold meat. Then came training. Yes, more training. Even experienced knights practiced their combat skills daily. Many knights devoted 2 to 3 hours each morning to physical training, regardless of the weather. Medieval training manuals suggest that knights should be able to mount a horse in full armor, ride at full gallop, and strike a target accurately with a lance. For knights who managed their own lands, which was most of them, the late morning and afternoon were filled with administrative duties. They had to settle disputes among peasants, collect taxes and rents, inspect their property, and meet with stewards. A knight's accounting ledger from 1407 shows that he spent more days dealing with property disputes than he did in actual combat. Being a medieval knight was like being a warrior, judge, tax collector, and property manager all rolled into one, except without the benefit of a smartphone calendar to keep it all straight. These land management duties weren't glamorous. Knights often had to decide who owned which chicken, where exactly a property boundary ran, or whether someone had the right to fish in a particular stream. One English manor's records from the 1300s show that nearly 40% of all cases brought to the knight involved stolen or damaged livestock. You train for 14 years to be an elite warrior, only to spend your Tuesday afternoon deciding who owns a questionable goat. Knights also had to enforce local laws and keep the peace. They were responsible for catching criminals and sometimes even carrying out punishments. This could involve organizing manhunts for outlaws, investigating crimes, and maintaining stocks or pillories for minor offenders. Food was another daily concern. Medieval meals for knights were substantial but not particularly fancy on normal days. An average knight consumed around 5,000 calories per day to maintain the strength needed for their physical demands. Records suggest knights ate about 2 pounds of meat daily, much more than the average peasant, but necessary for their lifestyle. Throughout all these activities, knights had to follow a strict code of behavior. The chivalric code wasn't just for special occasions, it governed everything from how a knight spoke to ladies to how he treated people of lower social status. Even leisure time came with obligations. Knights were expected to be accomplished in the knightly arts, which included music, poetry, dance, chess, and falconry. These weren't just hobbies, but social requirements. Medieval knights had to be deadly warriors by day and sophisticated entertainers by night, like a brutal combination of MMA fighter and theater kid. The physical toll of this lifestyle was immense. Even without battle wounds, the daily grind of training and labor left permanent marks on a knight's body that would follow them through the rest of their lives. After years of brutal training, tournaments, and battles, knights paid a heavy price with their bodies. Most were physically worn out by the time they hit 40, practically elderly by medieval standards. Knee problems were almost universal among knights past 30. Years of mounting horses, jousting, and fighting in heavy armor destroyed their knee cartilage. Studies of knight burial sites show knee joints with severe arthritis and signs of repeated trauma. Medieval knights invented the midlife crisis, only instead of buying a sports car, they just couldn't climb the stairs anymore. Back problems were another constant companion. The weight of armor and the impact of riding damaged the spine. Nearly 80% of examined knightly remains had compressed or herniated vertebrae. Many knights developed a permanent stoop as they aged. Shoulder injuries came from swinging swords and taking lance strikes. Hands developed early arthritis from gripping weapons. A knight with 40-year-old hands had the grip strength of a modern 90-year-old, making both fighting and writing love poems equally challenging tasks. Broken bones often didn't heal properly, leaving knights with crooked limbs. Head injuries accumulated from repeated concussions, which medieval medicine couldn't properly treat. Medieval knights basically invented CTE long before football players, just with more dragons in the mix. Wounds that never properly healed created chronic problems. Without antibiotics, even minor cuts could become infected. Dental problems were widespread due to their sugar-rich diet and lack of dental care. The medical care available was limited at best. Medieval medical advice basically boiled down to drink this mysterious herb tea and pray really hard, with predictably mixed results. Some knights retired early due to these physical limitations, sometimes as young as 35. Others joined monasteries where the more sedentary lifestyle gave their battered bodies a chance to recover. One French abbey had a special infirmary section for aged warriors seeking the peace of God and relief from their pains. Despite knowing the physical toll awaiting them, young men still eagerly pursued knighthood. The social prestige was powerful enough to overcome the certainty of a broken body by middle age. While real knights were limping around with bad knees and chronic pain, medieval storytellers were busy transforming the brutal reality of knighthood into something magical. The pain, stink, and endless drudgery got edited out, replaced by tales of perfect heroes performing impossible feats. Old songs made knights seem like superhuman figures. They could fight for days without tiring, defeat dozens of enemies, and always looked magnificent in their gleaming armor. The medieval equivalent of airbrushing, just paint over those battlefield infections and pretend that armor never chafed. The most popular tales portrayed warriors who embodied perfect virtues, always brave, loyal, and courteous. Real knights, however, were just regular humans trying to balance impossible expectations with their physical limitations. Literary texts reveal this growing gap between reality and fantasy. While poems celebrated knights fighting through grievous wounds without complaint, medical records from the same period show knights begging for pain relief and struggling to recover from minor injuries. Medieval audiences knew these stories weren't literally true, but they served an important social purpose. By idealizing knights, these tales created models for nobility to aspire to, while giving common people heroes to admire. Many knights went bankrupt trying to maintain their status, buying expensive armor and horses they couldn't afford. Records show that up to 40% of minor knights were in significant debt. Medieval knights, the original victims of keeping up with the Joneses, except the Joneses had a better horse and fancier helmet plume. What's most remarkable is how persistent these myths became. Even when gunpowder weapons began making knights obsolete on the battlefield, the romantic image of the knight remained powerful in European culture. The legends outlived the practical reality of knighthood by centuries. So there you have it, the brutal reality of knighthood. Real medieval knights weren't the shining heroes of legend. They were tough, suffering humans who paid a steep price for their status. Could you have handled it? In medieval times, warmth wasn't something people could easily get. For the upper class, turning their homes into cozy places took clever thinking and smart use of what they had. Despite the freezing cold outside, they made sure that their homes stayed warm, wrapping them in a constant embrace of coziness. And speaking of creativity, you won't believe the lengths these nobles went to. Their most impressive weapon against the cold was something we totally take for granted today: the fireplace. But hold on, these weren't your cozy modern fireplaces where you press a button and voila! These were massive, hungry beasts that devoured wood like teenagers raid a fridge. I'm not even exaggerating. Some households went through more than 150 logs per week. That's enough wood to build a small cabin, just to keep warm for 7 days. The centerpiece of any noble's castle wasn't some fancy throne or a portrait of serious-looking ancestors. It was these enormous fireplaces. Poor servants would trek through forests gathering wood like their lives depended on it, which, honestly, they kind of did. Getting creative with staying warm meant keeping these fire-breathing monsters well-fed at all times. Now, you might think having a fireplace meant living in tropical paradise, right? Wrong. Even with these roaring fires, castles were still cold enough to store ice cream if they had invented it yet. The heat from these fireplaces was like that one friend who refuses to share their snacks. It stayed pretty close to the source. This meant that medieval nobles basically played a never-ending game of musical chairs, except instead of music stopping, they were chasing warmth. But here's where their clever thinking really shone. They figured out that smoke shouldn't just hang around like an unwanted guest. That's why the invention of chimneys was such a big deal. Finally, you could breathe and be warmish at the same time. Revolutionary. Talk about getting creative with what you've got. The really wealthy folks got even smarter. They created what I like to call heat highways through their castles by installing multiple fireplaces. Important rooms would be near these heat sources, while the less crucial areas, well, let's just say if you were a medieval noble and someone suggested meeting in the North Tower in January, they probably weren't your friend. This strategic placement of fireplaces was their version of modern multi-zone heating, except instead of pressing buttons on a thermostat, you had to convince several servants to keep hauling wood up several flights of stairs. And the best part? These fireplaces weren't just about heating, they became the medieval version of social media, where all the hot gossip happened. Everyone would gather around them, sharing stories, probably complaining about the weather, some things never change, and finding creative ways to pretend they weren't freezing their noble behinds while enjoying that constant embrace of coziness they worked so hard to maintain. While fireplaces kept the common areas toasty, bedtime brought its own chilly challenges. Medieval nobles weren't about to let a little thing like freezing temperatures ruin their beauty sleep. Their bedchambers were like the world's first luxury sleep spas, minus the cucumbers on the eyes, and plus a whole lot of feathers. Let me tell you about these beds. We're talking serious cloud-like comfort here. The wealthy stuffed their mattresses with the finest down feathers money could buy. A noble's bed could contain feathers from over 100 birds. No wonder they slept until noon. I'd never want to leave that fluffy nest either. The real genius came in layers. First, there was the wool sleepwear, because nothing says sweet dreams like wearing a sheep. Then came the blankets. Not one, not two, but sometimes up to 7 layers of heavy wool quilts. By the time they were done piling them on, getting into bed was probably the day's workout. But here's my favorite part, the bed warmer. Before tucking in for the night, servants would take these metal pans filled with hot coals and slide them between the sheets like a medieval hot water bottle. Just don't roll over too quickly, or you might get more than just a warm bed. One wrong move and suddenly you're doing the medieval version of the floor is lava. The piece de resistance was the 4-poster bed with its heavy curtains. These weren't just for show or privacy. They were basically medieval sleeping bags. Once those curtains were drawn, you had your own little cocoon of warmth. Plus, they were excellent at muffling the sound of teeth chattering. And don't get me started on the carpets. These weren't your standard IKEA rugs. They were serious investments in foot comfort. Because let's face it, nothing ruins a cozy morning faster than putting your feet on a stone floor that feels like it's been storing ice since last winter. The wealthy would import exotic carpets from far-off lands, creating what might be the first ever heated floor system. Now, medieval nobles had some rather unconventional roommates when it came to staying warm. Cats weren't just adorable companions lounging by the fire, they were living, purring hot water bottles. But the real MVPs were the larger animals. Some nobles actually invited their livestock inside during winter. Talk about an exclusive indoor party. Studies suggest that a single cow could raise the temperature by 5 to 10 degrees in its immediate surroundings. Medieval nobles basically had their own portable heating system, just with more mooing. Before you wrinkle your nose, they weren't complete savages about it. These four-legged heaters had their own designated areas, usually separated from the main living spaces. The floor would be covered with thick layers of straw, kind of like nature's welcome mat. Servants had the glamorous job of regular cleanup duty, which probably wasn't listed in the perks of the position section. But hey, what's a little animal maintenance when you're getting free heating? The arrangement worked surprisingly well. The animals stayed cozy, the nobles stayed warm, and everyone pretended not to notice the occasional farmyard symphony echoing through the halls. It was the original win-win situation, even if it meant sometimes having to explain to visitors why there was a sheep in the next room attending to its wool-growing duties. On the topic of wool, medieval nobles weren't exactly hitting the catwalk in their winter wardrobes, but they sure knew how to dress for success, if success meant not turning into a human icicle. Their clothing strategy was basically more is more, and they took layering to an entirely new level. Starting from the inside out, they wore linen undergarments. Yes, even nobles had medieval underwear, but unlike our cotton basics, these were specifically designed to trap air close to the body. Next came the woolen tunics and gowns, often made from the finest sheep's wool money could buy. Fun fact, a single noble's winter outfit could use wool from up to 5 sheep. And these weren't your average itchy sweaters. We're talking about garments so well made that some have survived in museums to this day. The real showstoppers were their outer layers. Wealthy nobles draped themselves in furs and velvets that would make any modern fashionista green with envy. Fur-lined cloaks weren't just status symbols, they were basically walking blankets. And when I say fur, I'm not talking about a little trim here and there. These cloaks were often lined with multiple fox or marten furs, creating a toasty microclimate for their privileged wearers. But here's where it gets interesting. Their clothes were actually engineered for warmth. The seamstresses and tailors of the time were like medieval thermal engineers. They designed garments to be fitted at strategic points, creating air pockets that trapped warm air close to the body. It was like having a personal greenhouse effect minus the environmental concerns. Velvet was the medieval equivalent of today's performance fabric. Its thick pile trapped air and provided excellent insulation. A noble wearing a velvet gown lined with fur was essentially walking around in the medieval version of a NASA spacesuit, minus the helmet and with considerably more embroidery. The really clever bit? These outfits were designed to work together with all their other heating methods. Those layers worked perfectly when sitting near a fireplace, didn't get in the way when snuggling into their feather beds, and actually benefited from the ambient heat provided by their indoor animal heating system. The nobles might have looked like overstuffed peacocks, but they were warm, overstuffed peacocks. And let's not forget the accessories. Gloves lined with fur, boots padded with wool, and hoods that would make any modern hoodie jealous. Getting dressed in the morning probably felt like preparing for an Arctic expedition, but at least they looked fabulous while staying warm. Though I have to wonder, how did they manage to eat soup without dipping their fur-lined sleeves into it? When it came to keeping castles warm, medieval builders were absolute geniuses at playing the long game. Those massive stone walls weren't just for keeping out invading armies. They were medieval thermal batteries, built up to 12 feet thick in some places. That's the height of 2 tall men standing on each other's shoulders. These walls did something amazing. They soaked up heat during the day like a stone sponge and released it slowly at night. The stones weren't picked at random either. Builders specifically chose dense stones that could hold heat better than your grandmother holds onto family recipes. During summer days, these walls would warm up under the sun, and by night, they'd radiate that warmth back into the rooms. In winter, they'd capture whatever heat they could from those roaring fireplaces we talked about earlier. Windows? Well, they were more like arrow slits with delusions of grandeur. Medieval nobles weren't big fans of floor-to-ceiling windows, mainly because they hadn't figured out how to make large sheets of glass yet, but also because they knew bigger windows meant bigger heat losses. Their windows were small and strategically placed, usually on the south-facing walls where they could catch the most sunlight. They were like solar panels before solar panels were cool, except instead of generating electricity, they were letting in precious warmth. The builders had another trick up their sleeves. They made these windows slightly angled. The outside opening was smaller than the inside, which meant less cold air could get in, but the sunlight could spread out more once it entered the room. It was like having a medieval spotlight system, except instead of highlighting performers, it was highlighting the fact that medieval architects really knew their stuff. The walls were so thick that people used to joke that even gossip had trouble getting through them, but that thickness meant you could be standing next to a wall during a winter storm and it would feel barely cooler than the rest of the room. Not bad for people who didn't have physics textbooks or thermal imaging cameras. Speaking of keeping things cozy from top to bottom, medieval nobles didn't just stop at the walls. They looked up and thought, hey, what about the roof? Their solution? Thatched roofs that were basically the medieval equivalent of a winter hat for their homes. We're talking thick layers of straw or reed packed so densely you could barely push your finger through it. These weren't your basic grass haircuts for houses either. A properly thatched roof could be up to 2 feet thick, each piece of straw or reed carefully layered and positioned to create thousands of tiny air pockets. These air pockets were the real MVPs of medieval roof insulation. They trapped warm air trying to escape upward and kept cold air from sneaking in, working like nature's bubble wrap. The best part? These roofs were surprisingly smart. In summer, they'd keep the hot air out, and in winter, they'd keep the warm air in. It's like they invented climate control before climate control was even a thing. Plus, when it rained or snowed, the water would roll right off instead of soaking in, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. And here's a fun fact. A well-made thatched roof could last up to 60 years. That's longer than most modern roofs today. Though I suppose when your other option was freezing during winter, you made sure to do the job right the first time. While those cozy thatched roofs kept the warmth from escaping upward, medieval nobles had another brilliant idea for maximizing every bit of heat they could get. They turned winter into party season. They discovered something that college students in cramped dorms would later reinvent. Body heat is free heating. But unlike today's crowded parties, medieval gatherings were decidedly more sophisticated affairs. Well, most of the time. The great halls of medieval castles would often host gatherings where dozens of people would come together, and not just for the sparkling conversation. Scientists today tell us that a single person generates about the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Now multiply that by 50 or 60 people in a great hall, and you've got yourself a medieval radiator system powered by gossip and wine. These gatherings weren't just random crowdsourced heating events. Nobles would host elaborate feasts that could last for hours. Between the body heat, the roaring fires, and all the hot food being served, these parties could raise the temperature of a great hall by several degrees. Add in some dancing, because nothing warms you up like attempting a medieval jig in 7 layers of wool, and you had yourself a proper heating system. The clever bit was how they organized these gatherings. Important meetings? Schedule them for the coldest part of winter. Big feast? Make it a multi-day affair in January. Suddenly, being a social butterfly wasn't just about maintaining your status. It was about maintaining your body temperature. Musicians would play, storytellers would share tales, and everyone would laugh a bit louder than necessary. More movement equals more heat, after all. The real pros knew that a good argument about politics or the neighbor's new tapestry could warm up a room faster than any fireplace. Medieval nobles were basically running on drama-powered heating. And the best part? Nobody had to feel guilty about lingering too long at these gatherings. After all, they weren't being socially awkward. They were contributing to the communal heating system. It was basically medieval environmental consciousness at its finest. But some nobles weren't content with just body heat and fireplaces. The really fancy ones installed what I like to call the medieval underfloor heating system, the hippocaust. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of modern radiant floor heating, just with more smoke and significantly more manual labor. The system was brilliantly simple. A furnace would heat air that flowed through hollow spaces under the floors and sometimes inside the walls. Imagine walking on warm tiles in the dead of winter. Pretty luxurious for medieval times, right? The heated floors would radiate warmth upward, creating a cozy atmosphere that even those party-loving nobles envied. Of course, maintaining a hippocaust wasn't exactly a walk in the warm park. It required constant attention from servants who had to keep the furnace running and clean out the soot. But for those who could afford it, having warm floors was the ultimate medieval flex, like having heated car seats in a world of wooden benches. Speaking of keeping things toasty from below, while some nobles heated their floors with hippocausts, everyone's favorite heat source came from the castle kitchen. It wasn't just a place to whip up fancy feasts, it was practically a heating plant disguised as a cooking space. Those massive cooking fires did double duty, warming up the castle while preparing meals that could feed a small army, or one very hungry noble family. What's clever is how they maximized the heat from cooking. Stews and soups weren't just popular because they were filling. These dishes needed hours of slow cooking, which meant the kitchen fires stayed lit longer. The nobles basically invented the first slow cookers medieval style, and those heated stones used for cooking, they'd get tossed into drinking vessels to warm up wine or ale, creating the world's first heated beverages program. The kitchen was so warm that servants would often sneak in just to thaw out their frozen fingers. Between the constant cooking fires, the hot stones, and all that steam from bubbling pots, the kitchen was like a medieval spa, just with more onions and considerably less aromatherapy. The ways in which medieval upper-class people heated their homes were remarkably creative, combining practicality with available resources. From using animals for warmth to relying on the heat generated by cooking meals, these methods allowed them to stay comfortable during harsh winters. What's even more fascinating is that many of these techniques have endured in some form to this day. Whether it's the comfort of a crackling fire, the insulating properties of thick walls, or the cozy warmth that comes from communal gatherings. Despite the advances in technology, there's something timeless about how medieval people made the best use of what they had, turning necessity into innovation. Their resourcefulness in heating their homes continues to inspire modern solutions that blend history with practicality. Imagine managing the food supply for hundreds of hungry knights, servants, and nobles in a massive medieval castle. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, not even ice boxes, yet these stone fortresses somehow kept food fresh for months, or even years. It sounds impossible today, right? But for centuries, castle kitchens mastered the art of food preservation using surprisingly sophisticated methods that allowed them to store enough provisions to feed over 1,000 people for half a year. So how did they do it? Let's start underneath the castle. Medieval castle builders were onto something brilliant when they dug deep beneath their fortresses. These massive underground cellars turned out to be nature's refrigerator, maintaining a steady temperature around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, year-round. The deeper they went, the cooler it got, and castle designers took full advantage of this natural phenomenon. The cellars weren't just simple storage rooms. They were carefully planned labyrinths where different foods found their perfect homes at different depths. The lowest levels, reaching temperatures in the high 40s, stored milk, cheese, and fresh meat. A few steps up, you'd find the wine storage, and believe me, keeping the noble's wine fresh was probably more important than keeping the meat from spoiling. The upper levels housed hardier items like roots, apples, and preserved goods. These underground mazes were so vast that servants regularly got lost in them. They started leaving chalk marks on the walls to find their way back. Medieval breadcrumbs, if you will. One particularly unfortunate servant in Dover Castle was missing for 2 days before they found him sleeping next to a wine barrel. His excuse? "I got lost and the wine helped me stay warm." He kept his job, surprisingly enough. Not everything went smoothly in these underground food vaults. Rats were a constant menace. One castle record mentions losing an entire winter's cheese supply to a rat invasion. And then there was the flooding. Nothing ruins your day quite like finding your root cellar has become an underground pool. Speaking of preservation challenges, while these cellars were impressive, they weren't perfect, which is exactly why salt became medieval Europe's most valuable food preservation weapon. Ever wondered why we say someone's worth their salt or why we get a salary? Both phrases come from a time when salt was literally worth its weight in gold. Medieval castles went through mind-boggling amounts of the stuff. Records show that one average-sized castle would use up to 5,000 pounds of salt each year just to keep their food fresh. That's enough salt to fill a small bedroom. The castle's salt master, yes, that was a real job, knew exactly which type of salt worked best for different foods. Fine white salt was perfect for preserving dairy and delicate meats, while coarse sea salt was the go-to for tough cuts and fish. The science behind it is pretty simple. Salt pulls water out of food and out of any bacteria trying to spoil it. No water means no spoilage, which means happy, well-fed castle residents. Salt merchants became the medieval equivalent of tech billionaires. 1 pound of good salt could buy you a whole sheep, and the most successful salt traders owned entire fleets of ships. Of course, this led to some creative salt crimes. There are records of merchants caught selling fake salt made from ground white stones. Talk about taking assault and battery to a whole new level. Castle doctors even used salted foods as medicine. Got a headache? Try some salted fish. Stomach ache? Preserved lemons might do the trick. Though considering medieval medical practices, the salt was probably the least weird thing they prescribed. But salt wasn't the only way castles kept their food fresh. Sometimes they took a more smoky approach to preservation. The medieval castle smoking yard was like a prehistoric BBQ joint, minus the paper napkins and arguing about sauce recipes. These dedicated smoking houses, processing up to 200 pounds of meat per day during peak seasons, sat just outside the castle walls, far enough to prevent fire hazards but close enough to keep an eye on. Court records show that a castle housing 150 people needed about 18,000 pounds of smoked meat to make it through winter. No wonder the smoking houses were guarded. You wouldn't want someone sneaking off with your winter's worth of smoked bacon. Each type of wood used for smoking brought its own special flavor to the party. Oak was the go-to choice for most meats. It burned slow and steady, creating a rich, deep smoke that could preserve meat for up to 4 months. Applewood got saved for special occasions, perfect for smoking wild boar or venison for the Lord's fancy feasts. Alderwood was the fish's best friend, giving salmon and trout that delicate smoky taste we still love today. The castle smokemaster knew exactly which wood to use and when. Timing was everything in the smoking game. Late autumn saw the smoking houses working overtime, with 3 to 4 smoking chambers running simultaneously. The process wasn't quick. Some cuts of meat hung in the smoke for weeks, with hams taking up to 3 months to fully cure. Castle records show smoke masters working in shifts, keeping the fires going day and night. The funny thing is, many of these medieval smoking techniques aren't that different from what modern BBQ masters use. The main difference? Medieval smoke masters didn't have to worry about posting the perfect brisket pic on social media. While smoke worked wonders for meat and fish, vegetables needed a different approach, one that involved a lot more effort. Medieval castle kitchens took pickling to a whole new level. Archaeologists have uncovered massive pickling vessels in castle ruins that could hold up to 100 gallons each, enough to pickle 800 pounds of vegetables at once. That's a lot of medieval pickles. Records from Dover Castle show they pickled about 40 to 60% of their yearly vegetable harvest, turning their castle gardens into a year-round supply of vitamin C. But forget about just cucumbers and onions. Castle cooks pickled everything they could get their hands on. Cabbage? Of course. Turnips? You bet. Eggs and beet juice? Absolutely. And they turned a striking purple color that probably made more than a few castle kids giggle at dinner. Some castles even pickled imported fruits like lemons and oranges, treating them as precious commodities that only the Lord and his family got to enjoy. One medieval cookbook mentions a cranky baron who threatened to throw his cook in the dungeon for serving his specially pickled plums to the common soldiers. The castle gardens weren't just for show. They dedicated whole sections to growing herbs specifically for pickling. Dill, garlic, and mustard seeds were castle gardening staples. But the real MVP was vinegar production. Every serious castle had its own vinegar-making operation, usually tucked away in a corner of the castle because, let's face it, fermenting vinegar doesn't smell like roses. The pickling process was so important that many castles employed a dedicated pickle master who kept detailed records of every batch. These medieval recipe books survived centuries, showing us exactly how they did it. Some of their techniques were surprisingly advanced. They knew that adding grape leaves to pickle jars would keep the vegetables crispy, a trick many modern picklers still use today. Speaking of preservation techniques that stood the test of time, there was one sweet solution that medieval castles couldn't get enough of. In fact, it's so stable that archaeologists have found it still edible after thousands of years. Medieval castle folk knew all about honey's supernatural preservation powers, which is why they maintained extensive bee yards about a quarter-mile from their walls. These hives weren't just tucked away for safety, they were strategically placed near flowering meadows and orchards. A typical castle's bee operation included around 100 hives scattered across several locations, producing enough honey for both food preservation and medicine. Castle beekeepers lived in small cottages near their hives, making them the only skilled castle workers who didn't actually live inside the fortress. They got extra rations of ale. Apparently, medieval folks thought drinking helped prevent bee stings, and surprisingly, good pay. The castle infirmary kept its own separate honey stores, using specific types for different treatments. Light spring honey went to treating coughs and wounds, while darker autumn honey was saved for preserving fruits and meats. They even created specialized honey-preserved foods for sick patients. Fruits preserved in honey were a medieval hospital's version of get-well-soon candy. Speaking of preservation, the castle kitchen used honey in surprisingly creative ways. They dipped fresh fruit in heated honey to create a protective coating, layer root vegetables between honey-soaked linens, and even pack fish in honey for long journeys. One medieval recipe book describes how to preserve entire geese in honey, though it doesn't mention how they kept hungry servants from sneaking spoonfuls of the sweet preservative. The science behind honey's preserving power is pretty incredible. It's got so much sugar that bacteria can't grow in it, natural hydrogen peroxide that kills germs, and it's acidic enough to stop most microbes in their tracks. Plus, bees add an enzyme that turns it into honey superoxide, making it practically immortal. No wonder medieval castles valued their beekeepers almost as much as their master builders. All this talk of builders brings us to another crucial aspect of castle food preservation, the very architecture of the castle itself. Every stone, every passageway, every window had a part to play in keeping food fresh. Medieval castle architects were basically playing a giant game of Tetris with food storage. Every single room had to be carefully planned, from the massive grain silos that could hold 20,000 pounds of wheat to the tiny cheese caves that maintained perfect humidity. They even calculated room sizes using a special mathematical formula based on the castle's population. For every 100 people, they needed roughly 1,000 square feet of specialized storage space. The real genius showed up in their ventilation systems. Castle builders created natural air conditioning using something called pressure differential ventilation, fancy words for letting nature do the cooling work. They built tall, narrow shafts that ran from the deepest cellars to the highest towers. When the wind blew across the top of these shafts, it created a vacuum effect that pulled cool air up from underground. One castle in Wales was so good at this that servants would hang out in the storage rooms during summer to escape the heat. Pest control was built right into the walls. Builders installed special ledges and barriers that rats couldn't climb, created angled walls that made it hard for mice to run up, and even incorporated natural pest deterrents like herbs into the mortar mix. Sometimes they'd build cat runs, narrow passages that only cats could access, to let their furry exterminators patrol between walls. The castle kitchen itself evolved from a simple room with a fire to an intricate system of specialized spaces. The buttery for storing drinks, not butter, the pantry for bread and dry goods, and the spicery for expensive spices each had their own unique ventilation and humidity controls. Some castles even had special rooms just for aging cheese, with shelves angled to let whey drain properly. Though one castle steward complained in writing about the cheese room being too close to the Lord's chambers, apparently some aged cheeses were a bit too fragrant for noble noses. But even the cleverest architecture was useless without the right people to manage it. Enter the small army of workers who kept this massive food preservation machine running smoothly. Running a medieval castle kitchen was like managing a small city. The kitchen staff hierarchy started with the master cook. Under him, about 50 workers kept the massive food operation running, with roughly 15 dedicated to food preservation and storage. The yearly salary records from one castle show they paid their preservation master, a specialized cook, the equivalent of 30 sheep. Not bad for keeping the noble's dinner from spoiling. The kitchen apprentices started young, usually around age 12. Before touching a cooking pot, they spent 2 years learning crucial preservation skills like how to tell if meat was going bad by smell, tough first day on the job, how to rotate food stocks properly, and how to keep those pesky nobles from eating all the winter preserves too early. One apprentice's diary survives, complaining about having to memorize 200 different storage rules before being allowed to handle anything more important than turnips. Inventory tracking was seamlessly integrated into daily kitchen operations. Head cooks used tally sticks, wooden sticks with notches marking amounts, and parchment records. Each food type had its own tracking method. Wine barrels got chalk marks, grain got measured by standardized scoops, and preserved meats each got numbered tags. Archaeological digs have even found loaded dice near the hearth, gambling during breaks, anyone, and scratched recipes on kitchen walls. As organized as the kitchen system was, it faced its biggest test when the seasons changed. Each part of the year brought new challenges for food preservation. The medieval food preservation calendar kicked off in spring with a frenzy of pickling and smoking the last winter stores just as they were starting to turn. By early summer, castle kitchens were processing fresh herbs, drying them in bundles from the rafters. Summer brought a parade of fruits and vegetables that needed preserving. Kitchen records show one castle processed over 2,000 pounds of fresh produce in a single August week. Autumn was preservation crunch time. The castle kitchen turned into a nonstop preservation factory, with different teams handling smoking, salting, and pickling simultaneously. They even held preservation festivals where the entire castle staff pitched in, though records suggest these festivals were just as much about drinking ale as they were about storing food. One castle document mentions a cook who accidentally pickled his keys after a particularly festive preservation party. Winter brought its own challenges. The castle's master cook had to carefully calculate how much preserved food to use each week. Too generous in December meant hungry times in March. Castle records show they divided winter into 3 parts. Fresh stores, early winter when they could still use the newest preserved foods, deep stores, midwinter when they relied on longer-lasting preserves, and scraping by, late winter when meals got creative with whatever was left. Weather watching became a crucial skill. Castle staff developed detailed systems for predicting weather patterns, marking down everything from cloud shapes to animal behavior. One cook wrote that he knew winter would be harsh if the mice started stealing extra food before first frost, medieval weather forecasting at its finest. But even with the best seasonal planning, things could still go terribly wrong. When things went wrong, the famous siege of Dover Castle in 1216 tested their food preservation system like never before. The castle held out for over 3 months, largely thanks to their stored food supplies. But it wasn't just about having enough, it was about keeping what they had edible. When the castle's main cellar flooded during the siege, the kitchen staff had to quickly move tons of preserved food to higher ground. They managed it in a single night, though one unfortunate cook got locked in a storage room for 6 hours during the rush. Kitchen records reveal some creative emergency solutions. When rats chewed through grain storage bags, cooks started storing them in sealed clay pots. After mold destroyed an entire season's cheese supply at one castle, they developed a new system of rotating cheese wheels daily and rubbing them with vinegar. The medieval equivalent of quality control became serious business. Food tasters didn't just check for poison, they checked for spoilage too. Detecting spoiled food was an art form. Cooks used all their senses. The sound of tapping on preserves jars, different sounds meant different things. The feel of cured meats, too soft meant trouble. Even the color of pickled vegetables. One cook's manual warns, if your pickled eggs turn green, feed them to your enemy. At least they had a sense of humor about food safety. Castle records show they lost about 20% of preserved food to spoilage each year. Not bad, considering they had no refrigeration. When preserves did go bad, they had backup plans, sprouting grains in castle windowsills, smoking whatever meat they could find, and turning questionable wine into vinegar. Looking back at these medieval preservation methods, it's amazing how many of them we still use today. These old preservation methods weren't just about keeping food from spoiling. They created unique flavors that we still crave today. That smoky taste in your fancy ham? Thank a medieval smoke master. Those artisanal pickles at the farmer's market? They're using recipes that castle cooks would recognize. Even your grandmother's secret method of keeping vegetables fresh might have medieval roots. Living in a medieval castle was great if you were the king. Warm fires, roasted meat, people bowing wherever you walked. But for everyone else, without a crown or a throne. Castle life was cold, cramped, and full of hard work. Let's take a look at what they had to deal with. Let's start with the ones wearing jewels and velvet. The unfortunate noble ladies spent their days wrapped in clothing that would make modern torture devices seem comfortable. Every morning began with servants strapping them into tight corsets that squeezed their organs into new shapes. Then came the layers. Not 2 or 3, but often 5 or more separate pieces of clothing weighing up to 50 pounds total. Talk about the world's worst workout outfit. All day, every day, with no shower afterward. Summer brought no relief. While peasants could at least strip down to lighter garments, noble ladies kept those suffocating layers. Records show that several ladies in waiting fainted during particularly hot summer feasts in the 1300s. One French noblewoman's diary complained of spending July drowning in my own sweat beneath velvet that feels like hellfire. Their daily activities weren't much better than their wardrobe situation. Noble ladies spent hours upon hours learning skills that served almost no practical purpose. Embroidery with gold thread, playing the lute with proper finger placement, and memorizing hundreds of prayers in Latin, a language most couldn't even understand. Their education prepared them for one thing only, to be decorative and obedient. Most castle ladies couldn't read beyond basic prayers, couldn't manage finances, and certainly couldn't choose their own husbands. Marriages were arranged when girls were as young as 7 years old, with the actual wedding happening once they hit 12 or 13. Nothing says childhood like meeting your future husband when you're still playing with dolls. Freedom? Not a chance. Castle ladies rarely left their designated spaces. They spent days in the solar, a slightly less drafty room where they sewed by inadequate light until their eyes strained. Many developed terrible posture and eyesight by their 20s. Venture too far, and they'd be scolded for impropriety. Go outside? Only with permission, guards, and proper covering. Their most important job was producing children, specifically male heirs. Medieval medical texts show that women were blamed for all fertility problems. One treatise advised that if a woman couldn't conceive, she should be fed weird concoctions including powdered rabbit womb and crushed deer antlers. If she had only daughters, clearly she wasn't trying hard enough. The noble lady might have had jewelry and servants, but she lived in a prison of expectations, discomfort, and boredom. Her golden chains were just as binding as iron ones. Being at the top of castle life meant having the fanciest cage, with the best view of everyone else's misery. And while she sat in her solar counting stitches for the 1,000th time, elsewhere in the castle, others were facing their own unique versions of medieval suffering. Castle kitchen servants endured a special kind of hell. Their day began long before sunrise, when most castle residents were still snoring. By 4 in the morning, they were already hauling firewood, stoking flames, and preparing for the endless cooking demands of the day ahead. Medieval castle kitchens were basically fire hazards with roofs. Located far from the main hall to reduce fire risk, these sweltering chambers contained multiple hearths that burned constantly, raising temperatures to over 100 degrees. The only people in the castle who didn't need extra layers in winter were the kitchen servants. They were practically cooking themselves along with the food. The work never stopped. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and endless snacks for nobles who might decide they wanted a roasted peacock at midnight. Records from the 1300s show that large castle kitchens could serve up to 500 people daily, requiring kitchen servants to prepare dozens of different dishes for each meal. One medieval English castle went through over 2,000 loaves of bread and 23 barrels of ale in a single week. Burns, cuts, and injuries came with the job. Kitchens had stone floors that became slippery with grease, making falls common. Heavy pots could weigh up to 40 pounds when full, and dropping one meant both a mess and a beating. Medieval kitchen tools included massive meat hooks, razor-sharp cleavers, and cooking spits big enough to skewer an entire deer. The smells were a unique form of torture. Imagine the stench of poorly preserved meat, rotting vegetables, and smoke. All day, every day. Castle kitchens rarely had proper ventilation, so servants breathed in smoke until their lungs burned and their eyes watered. Their clothes smelled so bad that they weren't allowed to walk through certain parts of the castle, as if the nobles might die from commoner stink. The cruelest part? Kitchen servants rarely got to enjoy the food they slaved over. They ate scraps, burnt edges, and the cheapest ingredients. While they roasted exotic birds stuffed with spices for the Lord's table, their own meals consisted of watery porridge and stale bread. One medieval account describes kitchen boys fighting over the bones left over from the noble's feast just to suck out any remaining marrow. Their hands were permanently stained, their skin marked with burns, and their backs bent from endless hours of stirring, chopping, and carrying. And when the noble diners complained about food being too salty or not fancy enough, guess who took the blame? While the kitchen may have been a smoky inferno of endless work, at least these servants understood their role. Their suffering was straightforward, unlike others in the castle who faced different kinds of medieval misery with far more complicated rules. Speaking of complicated rules, no one had it worse than the young page boys of medieval castles. Childhood? Forget about it. For noble boys, growing up meant being shipped off to another lord's castle at 7 years old. 7. Modern kids that age are losing teeth and learning multiplication. Medieval boys were losing their families and learning how to serve strangers. The day began brutally early. Page boys were up before dawn, preparing their master's clothes, polishing boots, and fetching water. Their sleeping arrangements? Often just a thin mat on the floor of a hallway or antechamber. Medieval records show that in winter, page boys would sleep huddled together for warmth, sometimes taking turns staying awake to keep the fire going. Training was harsh and constant. These children had to master proper table manners, how to serve food without spilling, and memorize complex rules of etiquette. One wrong move, like pouring wine with your left hand instead of your right, could earn you a smack that would have modern parents calling lawyers faster than you can say child abuse. The education wasn't just about service, though. Pages spent hours each day learning skills for their future as knights, horse riding, sword fighting, and wrestling. Many suffered serious injuries during training. Medical records from one French castle documented 3 broken arms, 2 skull fractures, and countless bruises among pages in a single year. These weren't playground accidents. They were considered necessary toughening up. Pages also became professional sneaks and spies. Lords often used these children to gather information, sending them to eavesdrop on conversations or carry secret messages. The small size of young boys made them perfect for hiding in shadows and slipping through castle corridors unnoticed. The downside? Getting caught meant punishment for everyone involved, and medieval punishments were creative in the worst ways. Food was another sore spot. Pages were typically last to eat, getting whatever remained after knights and nobles had taken their fill. They had to stand during meals, sometimes for hours, watching others eat while their own stomachs growled. Nothing builds character like watching a fat lord stuff his face with roast goose while you wait for permission to eat crusty bread. Homesickness was crushing. Many page boys cried themselves to sleep during their first months away from home. Letters were rare, and visits home even rarer. Some wouldn't see their families for years. Records show that roughly 1 in 5 pages never completed their training. They either ran away, fell ill, or died from accidents. The most skilled pages would eventually graduate to becoming squires, a promotion that promised greater status but delivered mostly greater expectations. The higher you climbed in castle society, the fancier your problems became. Fancy problems indeed awaited those who reached knighthood. Despite all the romantic tales and heroic songs, being a medieval knight wasn't exactly a dream job. Let's start with their iconic armor, that shiny metal outfit that looked so impressive in tapestries. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 45 to 60 pounds. Wearing it was like carrying a third grader strapped to your body all day long. Summer fights were especially brutal. Knights would sweat so much inside their metal casings that they could lose up to 2 gallons of water during a single battle. Many passed out not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. One medieval medical text advised pouring cold water over a knight's head before battle, not for blessing, but to prevent them from cooking inside their own armor. Knights didn't die in battle so much as they were slowly steamed like medieval lobsters. The discomfort didn't end with temperature issues. Chafing was a knight's constant companion. Their underpadding, called an akiton or gambeson, was essentially a thick quilted jacket worn beneath the armor to prevent metal from digging into skin. But after hours of riding and fighting, these padded garments would become sweat-soaked torture devices, creating painful rashes that could become infected. Training was a lifelong commitment that started around age 7 as a page, continued through the teenage years as a squire, and finally culminated in knighthood, typically in their early 20s. By the time a man became a knight, he'd already spent more than half his life preparing for it. Archaeological studies of knight remains show distinctive bone deformations from years of sword practice and horse riding, their bodies literally molded by their profession. Then, there was the constant expectation of violence. Knights were essentially medieval soldiers on permanent standby. When their lord called, they had to drop everything and fight, even in conflicts they didn't understand or support. Historical records show that many knights went into crushing debt trying to meet their military obligations. A typical knight's equipment could cost the equivalent of a small house in today's money, and they had to provide their own. Jousting, the glamorous sport of knights, was deadly serious. Lances were designed to shatter on impact to reduce fatalities, but deaths were still common. Medical records from tournaments show horrific injuries: broken necks, punctured lungs, shattered jaws. Even victorious knights often walked away with concussions that would bench a modern football player for a season. The average professional jousting career lasted about as long as a mayfly, if the knight was lucky. The code of chivalry created impossible standards too. Knights were expected to be fierce warriors, yet gentle courtiers, loyal to their lord, yet defenders of the weak, ruthless in battle, yet merciful to the defeated. Living with these contradictions drove many to crisis. Medieval literature is filled with knights questioning their purpose and suffering what we now recognize as PTSD. While knights worried about honor and glory, someone else handled the unglamorous business of keeping the castle from falling into complete chaos. Who exactly kept medieval chaos at bay? Meet the castle constable, the medieval equivalent of a building manager, security chief, and human complaint box, all rolled into one miserable package. While knights gallivanted off to glory, constables stayed behind to handle the endless, thankless work of making sure the castle didn't fall apart or get conquered while everyone was sleeping. The constable's day never really ended. Dawn to dusk, try dusk to dawn to dusk again. These poor souls were responsible for organizing guard rotations, maintaining the physical structure of the castle, managing food stores, and ensuring that weapons remained in working order. Medieval records from one English castle show that a constable was expected to inspect the entire perimeter walls twice daily, a walk of over 2 miles, often in terrible weather. Security was their greatest headache. A breach in castle defenses wasn't just a job failure. It meant death for potentially everyone inside. Constables lived with this pressure constantly. They checked every guard post, supervised the raising and lowering of drawbridges, and personally held the keys to the most important gates and doors. One medieval text advised constables to sleep with castle keys tied to their wrists to prevent theft, because nothing says restful sleep like 2 pounds of iron jangling against your face all night. The job came with impossible expectations. If anything went wrong, from a leaky roof to an enemy attack, the constable took the blame. Medieval castle accounts contain endless examples of constables being fined for everything from insufficient vigilance to allowing a torch to go out on the east wall. One unfortunate constable in France was held responsible when a storm damaged the castle's grain stores, as if he personally invited the lightning. The thankless tasks never stopped. Constables conducted inspections of the food supplies, interrogated suspicious visitors, and settled disputes among castle staff. They enforced the Lord's justice within the castle walls, which meant collecting fines and handing out punishments. Not exactly the way to win popularity contests in medieval society. Medieval records show constables were second only to tax collectors in receiving death threats from angry peasants. Living quarters revealed the constable's awkward middle status. Not quite noble enough to dine at the Lord's table, yet not common enough to relax among the servants. Many constables had small private chambers, usually positioned near castle entrances or armories, convenient for work, terrible for sleep. Historical records show that the average constable lasted only 4 to 6 years before asking to be relieved, either from stress, exhaustion, or the endless complaints. Perhaps the worst part was the constant undermining from above. Lords would override constable decisions, yet still hold them responsible for the outcomes. Knights would bypass security protocols, then blame the constable when problems arose. Servants would ignore maintenance schedules, then complain when equipment failed. At least the constable had a room to themselves, unlike those who experienced the most notorious area of castle life. The constable might have had sleepless nights worrying about castle security, but far below, others experienced a darkness that went beyond mere shadows. Darkness had many meanings in medieval castles, but none more literal than life in the dungeons. These weren't the tidy cell blocks shown in movies. Medieval castle dungeons were often converted storage rooms, dried-up wells, or purpose-built pits designed to make human existence as miserable as possible. What got you thrown into these nightmare spaces? Almost anything. Debt was a common reason. Fail to pay what you owe, and down you went until your family scraped together enough money. Political disagreements with the local lord? That was good for a few months in darkness. Accused of theft without proper proof? The dungeon waited for you. Medieval justice wasn't big on innocent until proven guilty. It leaned more toward guilty until you confess or die, whichever comes first. The physical conditions defied human endurance. Most dungeons had no windows, no light, and no heating. Stone walls wept with constant moisture, creating the perfect breeding ground for mold and disease. Floors were rarely more than packed dirt, often saturated with waste from previous prisoners. Medieval dungeon maintenance consisted of occasionally throwing down straw, less for prisoner comfort and more to soak up the mess so the smell wouldn't reach the upper floors. Sleeping arrangements? There weren't any. If you were lucky, you might have straw. Unlucky prisoners slept directly on damp stone or dirt. Bedding was virtually non-existent except for the wealthiest prisoners who could pay for such luxuries. Rats were your constant companions, bold enough to nibble on sleeping prisoners. One medieval account describes prisoners tying their hair up at night to prevent rats from chewing it off while they slept. Food came irregularly and was barely edible when it arrived. In many castles, feeding prisoners wasn't considered the lord's responsibility. Family members had to bring food or pay the guards to provide it. No family or money? You might get a crust of bread and water every couple of days, just enough to keep you alive for more questioning. Records from one English castle show that the average prisoner lost 20 to 30 pounds during a typical 3-month confinement. Medical care didn't exist. Cut yourself on a rusty chain? Develop a fever from drinking filthy water? Tough luck. Infection was a common cause of death among dungeon prisoners. One medieval medical text described dungeon fever as the sickness that comes from breathing the air where many unwashed bodies have dwelled in darkness. Doctors rarely visited prisoners unless they were valuable hostages worth keeping alive. The psychological torture may have been worst of all. With no sense of time, no human contact beyond occasional guard visits, and no knowledge of when or if release might come, many prisoners simply lost their minds. The total darkness, constant dripping water, and distant sounds of castle life continuing above created a disorienting nightmare that broke even the strongest spirits. At least these wretched souls had someone checking on them occasionally. In the midst of all this suffering, various castle inhabitants turned to the only person who supposedly had a direct line to divine mercy: the castle priest. These men of God found themselves in perhaps the most awkward position in the entire feudal system. They were supposed to be messengers of heavenly authority, yet completely dependent on earthly lords for their daily bread. Talk about job insecurity. One sermon against gluttony, and suddenly the priest finds himself preaching to squirrels in the forest. Castle priests began their days before sunrise with early morning prayers. Medieval religious schedules required multiple prayer services throughout the day. Prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. That meant the priest was working before everyone else woke up and still murmuring Latin prayers when the guards changed for night watch. Medieval priests didn't need alarm clocks. Eternal salvation anxiety did the trick just fine. In theory, priests held moral authority over even the castle lord. In practice, criticizing your food provider was dangerous business. Records show multiple cases of priests being dismissed from their positions for daring to scold noble patrons about their less than holy behavior. One English priest was thrown out for suggesting the Lord's drinking habits were excessive. His replacement learned to look the other way when wine flowed freely. Holy water for the chapel, wine for the Lord, and blind eyes for the priest. The job description kept expanding in bizarre ways. Beyond spiritual duties of prayer, confession, and communion, priests were expected to perform an endless list of religious tasks for superstitious castle inhabitants. They blessed swords before battle, shields before tournaments, bread before baking, beds before births, and for some reason were always called to inspect strange mold on the wall that someone thought looked like a saint's face. Confession duty created the most uncomfortable moments. Castle priests heard every secret, scandal, and sin from everyone, but were unable to act on any of it due to the sacred seal of confession. One French manuscript mentions a castle priest who developed a facial twitch from the stress of holding in so many secrets. Medieval castle priests were essentially therapists without degrees, confidants without choice, and the only men in the castle who might actually prefer deafness as a career advantage. During times of crisis, priests faced impossible demands. When disease struck, they were expected to visit the sick despite the risk. When food grew scarce, they were supposed to explain why God allowed hunger. When battles went poorly, they had to justify divine plans that included defeat. If too many children died in winter, if crops failed in summer, somehow the priest needed to have a theological explanation ready. While the priest struggled with these spiritual burdens, at least he didn't have to deal with the castle's most disgusting problems directly. Every castle's worst job belonged to the Gong farmer, the unfortunate soul responsible for removing human waste from the castle's privies and cesspits. Medieval toilets, called garderobes, were basically holes that dropped waste directly down the castle walls or into collection pits. After months or years of use, someone had to clean them out. Enter the Gong farmer. These brave workers crawled into narrow waste chutes armed with shovels, buckets, and strong stomachs. They collected night soil, the polite term for human excrement, and hauled it outside the castle walls for disposal. Medieval castles produced roughly 50 pounds of human waste daily, meaning Gong farmers literally dealt with tons of crap every year. The job paid surprisingly well for obvious reasons. Records show Gong farmers earned up to 3 times more than average laborers. The medieval career guidance counselor's advice was simple: hold your nose and think of the money. Most Gong farmers worked at night to minimize the smell's impact on castle life and likely died young from disease exposure. Without them, though, castle life would have been even more unbearable than it already was for everyone else trapped within those stone walls. Before air conditioning, staying cool wasn't easy. There were no fans, no cold air, and no quick fixes. Medieval peasants had to deal with heat every day, with nothing to help but their own habits. Here's how they got through the hottest months. And it all started with the one place they spent the most time. Medieval peasant houses were built like ovens with doors. These homes used wattle and daub construction, which meant weaving thin branches together and covering them with mud, clay, and animal dung. Building with poop was apparently considered normal back then, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval home improvement standards. The walls were thick and heavy, made from rough stones mixed with wooden beams that came from whatever trees grew nearby. While this sounds strong, it created homes that soaked up heat during the day and refused to let it escape at night. The roofs caused the biggest problems. Thatched roofs made from dried grass, reeds, or straw were terrible at keeping heat out. These roofs were thick and dense, which meant they absorbed the sun's warmth like a giant sponge and then slowly released it into the house all day and night. The thatch also provided luxury penthouses for rats, birds, and bugs who probably left better reviews than the human tenants living below. Most peasant homes had floors made of packed dirt or clay that had been stomped down by countless feet over many years. During hot weather, these floors became scorching and turned into dust clouds that made breathing difficult. Having a dirt floor in summer was like living on top of a giant heating pad that never turned off. Windows were tiny when they existed at all. Many peasant homes had no glass windows because glass cost too much money and was hard to make. Instead, they used wooden shutters that could be opened during the day to let in some air. But opening shutters during summer meant letting in hot air, dust, and flying insects. Keeping them closed meant trapping stale, heated air inside. Either way, you were choosing between being roasted or being choked. The lack of proper airflow was made worse because most peasant homes were small, cramped spaces. Whole families lived in single rooms that were usually no bigger than a modern closet. When you packed 6 to 8 people into such a tiny space, body heat alone could make the temperature unbearable. It was like a medieval sauna that nobody asked for. Chimneys were expensive luxuries that most peasants could not afford. Instead, smoke from cooking fires escaped through holes in the roof or through open doors and windows. This meant that hot smoke filled the house before finding its way outside. These smoke holes were basically medieval air conditioning, except instead of cool air, they pumped in more heat and the occasional bird. Peasant homes were often built close together in villages, which meant there was little room for air to move between buildings. The narrow paths and alleys between houses created blocked areas that trapped hot air instead of letting it flow freely. Living in these homes during summer was like being trapped inside a bread oven that someone forgot to turn off. But dealing with sweltering homes was only part of the challenge peasants faced during summer heat. Medieval peasants dressed like they were preparing for winter even when the summer sun was blazing overhead. Their clothing choices were decided by what they could afford and what was available, not by comfort or staying cool. Most peasants wore wool garments year-round because wool was the most common fabric they could make or buy, and having different wardrobes for different seasons was a luxury they could not afford. The basic outfit for a male peasant included a linen shirt worn next to the skin, covered by a wool tunic that reached somewhere between the waist and knees. Over this, they often wore a wool cloak, especially when working outside. Basically, they were wearing 3 layers in weather that would make modern people want to walk around in their underwear. Women faced even greater challenges. They wore long linen undergarments beneath wool dresses that covered them from neck to ankles. The dresses were usually loose to allow movement during work, but they still trapped heat and stopped air from moving around the body. On top of this, married women had to cover their heads with linen veils or wool coverings, adding another layer of heat. The linen undergarments were the only relief from summer heat, but even these caused problems. Linen was cooler than wool, but it was still heavy fabric compared to modern standards. More importantly, linen cost a lot of money and was hard to clean, so most peasants owned only 1 or 2 linen pieces that they wore repeatedly without washing. Wearing the same sweaty undergarment for weeks was like wrapping yourself in a damp, heated blanket. Wool had some good points. It lasted a long time, stayed somewhat warm when wet, and could be made locally. But wool in summer was torture. The thick fibers trapped body heat and sweat, creating a constant feeling of being wrapped in a hot, wet cover. The wool used by peasants was rough and scratchy, not the soft wool we know today. Washing garments was a huge job that happened only a few times each year. Peasants had to carry water, heat it over fires, and scrub clothes by hand using harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash. The process took a whole day and needed good weather for drying. As a result, people wore their garments until they were literally falling apart, building up layers of sweat, dirt, and smells that made the heat even more unbearable. Most peasants owned only 2 or 3 sets of garments total. This meant wearing the same outfit for weeks or months before switching to a slightly different version of the same heavy, hot clothes. The idea of summer clothes and winter clothes was as strange to them as the idea of flying horses. Footwear was another source of heat and discomfort. Leather shoes cost too much and often did not fit right. So many peasants went barefoot during summer. Walking on hot dirt roads and sun-baked fields without shoes was painful, but it was often more comfortable than wearing thick leather boots that trapped heat and moisture. The social rules around dressing made it impossible to adapt to hot weather. Removing layers in public was considered improper, especially for women. Even peasants were expected to maintain certain standards of dress when they were around other people. Taking off your outer tunic because of heat was like showing up to church in your night clothes. Possible, but socially disastrous. But even with all these clothing challenges, medieval peasants found creative ways to beat the heat when it became too much to bear. When summer heat became unbearable, medieval peasants had to get creative with cooling methods that would make modern people realize just how lucky we are. These were not fancy techniques based on science. They were desperate actions born from necessity and handed down through generations of people who knew what it felt like to slowly cook in their own homes. The most popular cooling trick was simply moving somewhere else. When houses became too hot, whole families would leave their homes and sleep outside under the open sky. This was not fun camping. It was survival. People would drag straw beds, blankets, and pillows outside and make temporary sleeping spots in their yards, gardens, or even in village streets. Sleeping outside was like moving from a frying pan to the ground next to the frying pan. Not perfect, but definitely better. Finding shade became a daily hunt. Peasants would plan their schedules around moving shadows, following patches of shade like thirsty travelers following water sources. Large trees were prime real estate during summer months. Oak, ash, and beech trees with thick leaf covers became informal meeting places where people would gather to escape the sun. The shade under these trees could be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than direct sunlight. Stone walls and buildings provided another source of cooling relief. The thick stone walls of churches, castles, and larger buildings stayed cooler than wood and clay structures. Peasants would lean against these walls, sit in their shadows, or even lie down on the ground next to them to soak up some of the coolness. Church interiors were especially popular because the thick stone walls and high ceilings created naturally cooler spaces. Water was the ultimate luxury for cooling, but it was often hard to find and not always clean. Rivers, streams, and ponds became gathering places where people would soak their feet, splash water on their faces, and even strip down for quick baths when nobody was watching. The village well was often the coolest spot in town because it was built over underground water that stayed at the same temperature all the year. Peasants developed clever ways to use small amounts of water for maximum cooling effect. They would soak pieces of cloth in cold water and wrap them around their necks, wrists, or heads. The drying of the water would create a cooling effect that could last for an hour or more. Underground spaces offered the best cooling relief. Root cellars, storage holes, and even wells provided access to the naturally cool temperatures found below ground. The Earth several feet below the surface stays at a fairly constant temperature year-round, usually around 50 to 60 degrees. Peasants would climb down into these spaces during the hottest parts of the day. The most effective cooling method was often simply accepting that you were going to be hot and miserable, and trying to make the misery as small as possible. Medieval peasants developed a mental toughness that allowed them to function in conditions that would send modern people running for the nearest air-conditioned building. The search for coolness affected every decision peasants made during hot weather, including what they chose to consume. Medieval peasants ate meals that would make modern people question everything about their food choices, especially during summer when heat made every bite feel like punishment. The basic peasant diet consisted of foods that created heat, spoiled quickly, and required cooking over open fires that turned kitchens into furnaces. Eating hot soup on a 90-degree day was basically medieval self-torture disguised as lunch. Pottage was the foundation of peasant nutrition throughout the year, and summer was no different. This thick soup was made from whatever grains, vegetables, and scraps were available, usually barley, oats, onions, cabbage, and turnips. It was cooked in large iron pots over open fires, filling homes with hot steam and smoke. During summer, standing over a hot fire to stir pottage was like volunteering to work inside a volcano. Bread was another main food that created heat problems. Most peasants could not afford to have ovens in their homes, so bread was baked in shared ovens used by entire villages. These ovens were massive stone structures that were heated with wood fires until they reached temperatures hot enough to bake dozens of loaves at once. Eating medieval peasant bread in summer was like swallowing a heated brick that sat in your stomach for hours. Fresh food was expensive, and peasants could not afford to waste it, but summer heat made food preservation a constant battle. Vegetables from gardens had to be eaten quickly before they rotted, which meant consuming them at whatever temperature they happened to be, usually warm from sitting in the sun. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, processes that created foods that were incredibly salty and dense. Salt pork, dried fish, and smoked meat were common peasant foods, but they made people thirsty and created body heat during digestion. Eating salty preserved meat on a hot day was like adding fuel to an already blazing fire. Ale was the main drink for peasants, consumed in amounts that would shock modern people. A typical peasant might drink 1 to 2 gallons of weak ale per day because it was safer than water and provided calories and nutrients. However, brewing ale required boiling water and grains, adding more heat to already hot homes and villages. Brewing ale in summer was like hosting a steam bath party that nobody wanted to attend, but everyone needed because they had to have something safe to drink. Water was often unsafe to drink because it came from sources that were polluted by human and animal waste. Wells, streams, and ponds were often located near outhouses, animal pens, and garbage areas. This meant that peasants could not simply drink water to stay hydrated during hot weather. The timing of meals was influenced by heat as much as by work schedules. The main meal of the day was usually eaten in the late morning or early afternoon, when the heat was already building, but before it reached its peak. This meant that people were eating their largest, hottest meal just as the temperature was becoming unbearable. It was like eating a holiday feast inside a sauna. Dairy products were especially problematic during summer. Milk, cheese, and butter spoiled quickly in hot weather, and there was no effective way to keep them cool. Fresh milk had to be consumed within hours of milking, and cheese making was a race against spoilage. Trying to make cheese in summer heat was like trying to build a snowman in a desert. Technically possible, but probably not worth the trouble. But despite these challenges with food and drink, peasants found ways to adapt their social activities and daily routines to cope with the blazing heat. Medieval villages transformed completely during summer as peasants fled their sweltering homes and turned public spaces into outdoor living areas. The social life of entire communities shifted outside, creating scenes that would look chaotic to modern eyes but made perfect sense to people who were desperately trying to escape the heat. Village greens became the center of summer life. These central areas, usually patches of grass or dirt surrounded by houses and shops, were transformed into outdoor workspaces where entire families would spend their days. People would bring their tasks outside, spreading out materials for spinning, weaving, and other crafts under whatever shade they could find. The village green in summer looked like a giant outdoor factory where everyone was trying to get work done while slowly melting. Churches became unofficial cooling centers during summer months. The thick stone walls, high ceilings, and shaded interiors of churches provided some of the coolest spaces available to peasants. People would arrive early for services and stay long after they ended, finding excuses to spend time in the relatively cool interior. Public wells became major social hubs during hot weather. These were not just places to get water. They were community gathering spots where people could cool off, wash their hands and faces, and catch up on village gossip. The area around a well was often several degrees cooler than the surrounding village because of the underground water source. Rivers, streams, and ponds were transformed into public cooling areas where normal social rules were relaxed out of necessity. People would wade into water fully dressed, remove shoes and stockings to soak their feet, and even strip down for bathing when privacy allowed. Shade trees became prime real estate that was claimed early in the day and defended throughout the hot hours. Large oak, ash, and beech trees with thick canopies could accommodate dozens of people in their shade. Families would establish temporary camps under these trees, bringing cushions, blankets, and work materials to create outdoor living spaces. A good shade tree in summer was more valuable than silver, mainly because you could not sit under silver to escape the heat. Children had more freedom to adapt to the heat than adults. They would spend entire days outside, often naked or wearing only thin linen shirts, playing in mud puddles, splashing in streams, and finding cool spots that adults were too dignified to use. Taverns and alehouses adapted to summer heat by extending their operations outdoors. Wooden benches and tables were moved outside under whatever shade was available, creating outdoor dining areas that were cooler than the stuffy interiors. Taverns in summer were like medieval comfort zones. They did not actually cool you down, but they made you care less about being hot. The social dynamics of villages changed during summer heat. People who might normally keep to themselves were forced to seek out shared cooling areas, creating interactions that would not happen during cooler weather. Summer heat was like a medieval social mixer. It forced everyone to come together, whether they wanted to or not. But even with all these adaptations to public spaces and outdoor living, the biggest challenge remained getting enough rest. Medieval peasants had to completely reorganize their sleep patterns during summer, creating schedules that would confuse modern people but made perfect sense for those trying to survive without any form of cooling technology. Sleep became a strategic activity that required careful planning, flexible scheduling, and a willingness to abandon traditional ideas about when and where rest should happen. The basic problem was that peasant houses remained hot long after the sun went down. The thick walls, thatched roofs, and poor ventilation meant that buildings absorbed heat throughout the day and released it slowly during the night. Trying to sleep in a medieval peasant house during summer was like trying to take a nap inside a bread oven that someone had forgotten to turn off. Work schedules were completely reorganized around the heat. Peasants would wake up well before dawn, sometimes as early as 3 or 4 in the morning, to take advantage of the coolest hours of the day. They would work for several hours while the air was still cool from the night, then take a long break during the hottest part of the day, usually from late morning until late afternoon. This schedule created a natural rest period that was essential for survival. During the hottest hours of the day, Typically between noon and 4 in the afternoon, entire villages would shut down. People would seek out the coolest places they could find and rest until the heat became bearable again. The medieval rest period was not a luxury. It was a matter of not collapsing from heat exhaustion. Sleeping arrangements became incredibly flexible during summer. Families would abandon their beds and sleep wherever they could find cooler conditions. Straw mattresses, blankets, and pillows were dragged outside to create sleeping areas in gardens, courtyards, and even in the middle of village streets. Medieval villages during summer nights looked like giant camping trips where everyone had forgotten to bring tents. The floors of peasant houses, which were usually packed earth or clay, became sleeping surfaces during hot nights. People would lie directly on the ground inside their homes because it was cooler than sleeping on raised beds or mattresses. Some peasants would even dig shallow depressions in their floors to create slightly cooler sleeping spots. Sleep quality was terrible during summer heat waves. People would doze fitfully for short periods, wake up sweating and uncomfortable, then try to find cooler spots or cooler positions. Medieval summer sleep was less like a good night's rest and more like a series of uncomfortable naps interrupted by desperate searches for cooler air. The concept of privacy almost disappeared during the hottest nights. Entire families would sleep in the same room or outdoor area, not because they wanted to be close together, but because they had to share whatever cool spots were available. Night shifts became common during harvest season and other periods of intense work. Peasants would work in shifts, with some people working during the cooler night hours while others slept, then switching roles during the day. Sleeplessness was probably the most common problem among medieval peasants during summer, though they did not have a word for it. They just called it another miserable hot night. The combination of heat, discomfort, and irregular schedules meant that many people were constantly tired during the summer months. Children adapted to summer sleeping patterns more easily than adults. They would sleep in shifts, taking naps during the day in whatever cool spots they could find, then staying up later in the evening when adults were trying to sleep. Morning routines were adjusted to take advantage of cool air. People would wake up before dawn not just to start work, but to enjoy the only comfortable hours of the day. The period from about 4 to 7 in the morning was often the only time when peasants could be truly comfortable, and they learned to treasure these brief hours of relief. Medieval peasants developed a level of heat tolerance that would amaze modern people, but even they had their limits. The combination of hot days, sweltering nights, and constant physical labor created conditions that tested human endurance to its breaking point. Yet somehow, they survived these brutal summers year after year, developing strategies and adaptations that allowed them to function in conditions that would send modern people running for the nearest air-conditioned building.